The involvement of Wojtek in the war came really right at the beginning of his life in 1942, when he was picked up, by people coming out of the Siberian gulags. And those Poles, when they picked him up, were really heading for the Middle East so they could join the big push to end the war. Unfortunately, they didn't realise it was 3 years on. So Wojtek effectively became the mascot, and he grew up within that Polish community. There was both the Polish Women's Army and the Polish Army themselves. But of course, they were sitting there in the Middle East and they needed to be closer to the European front. And they were sent to Italy, where they were at Monte Cassino. When the war ended, they shipped the Poles and the bear to Scotland, and the decision then, of course, what to do with the men and the bear. But the men, of course, by that time, like the bear, was a displaced person. But what the bear did all through that time was he actually became much loved, by the soldiers. He was incredibly well treated, and he kept the morale up, and that's what he did. And one of the most famous sightings of him was at Monte Cassino, where he was carrying ammunition boxes, not the shells, but the ammunition boxes. So it is an incredible story, but it was a story of comradeship, really. Animals in war. The point about Wojtek is that he was picked up at such a young age and became humanized very, very quickly. He had no idea, we believe, that he was a bear. He had no idea he was an animal. He thought he was an ordinary human being. He acted like a human being. He would sit and have his lunch and have meals or, a drink of tea with the men. He ate from a plate, and he probably, I know within Edinburgh Zoo they tried to introduce other bears, and he was quite horrified that they'd put these animals in with him, so he just totally ignored them. So he was also treated we keep hearing that people who are traumatized and brutalized, as many of the Poles were in the gulags, that people who have gone through that terrible conflict often brutalize again through abuse. In fact, it was the opposite with the Poles. The Poles actually poured a great deal of love into the bear, and there was no cruelty involved in it, and that's why he was so docile. So much so that when he came to Scotland first and was on our farm, the local children could ride on his back, and he attended children's parties. So try getting that through health and safety now. So it's just all about the way he was handled and cared for. My grandfather was with the bear. He was a Scottish soldier. He was with the King's Own Scottish Borderers. It was his task by the time they got to Iraq to get those men fit and back into some kind of fitness to effectively go to war and help the Allies at that time. Ironically, having survived Siberia, so my grandfather effectively was to get them back into a fighting force. He told me about the story of the bear, because he was with the bear for something like 8 months, and the men. And he told me the story of the bear. He never talked about the war, but he talked about the bear, the Polish bear. And it was many years later, he came back to Berwick-upon-Tweed, to the barracks of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and he was asked if he would go up and make sure that the Poles were being looked after. And he visited the camp that they were all on in Scotland. And many years later, I got married, and I married a man. I didn't know until I got married that I married the man who actually owned Winfield Camp. And this was after I got married, and it seemed ironic that all the way through my life I'd heard about the bear and I'd married the man who owned the camp. But it also allowed me to meet one of the people who were with the bear, who's still living in the borders in our village, and who had worked on our farm, Kay Kerluski. And he told me he could remember my grandfather coming and wrestling with the bear, you know, at the camp. So it's a very personal story to me. But my grandfather, as I say, I have no Polish connections whatsoever, but my grandfather always told me, always remember what the Poles did for you, you know, gave you freedom, and how lucky we were that we hadn't been invaded. But, you know, the sacrifice that was made for the countries who did get invaded and were so badly treated.